Let me start with a framing concern. My concern is that in an effort to provide space for the matters of concern of traditionally marginalized and or underrepresented groups here at SEAS, that someone on some committee decides that the answer lies in simply recording, e-casting, or extending presentations before and around the geographic conference that is for SEAS. We can already see this move beginning to emerge in our current program and online communications with the organization. With that in mind, here is my question. Can a remixed presentation placed online create the same rhetorical space as a live rhetorical performance? Here's an example of what I mean. So what would have happened to Donnie Sakay's panel this afternoon if we had substituted him for my soon-to-be remixed video of his presentation? My hunch is, based on the reactions to videos I have seen given at conferences, nothing. Well, almost nothing. It would have gone on almost exactly the way embodied presentations go. In fact, so much remains unchanged that, and I think you can see this in any presentation where there is a video, audiences behave politely. The audience sits and listens the same way they do when there is a live rhetor. Audiences even give applause to people who are not there, like at ATTW's video keynote on Wednesday. And in the discussion Q&A afterwards, people might engage the ideas of his presentation along with the ideas of other speakers as politely and professionally as they did this afternoon. So why is that? Why treat a video like a rhetor? Well, one way to think about why rhetorical situations function this way is to think about a conference presentation as an object in the actor network sense. That is to say, we think of conference presentations as a single object, a rhetorical situation, and we think of them as so tightly bound that we can move them from physical to physical place. For instance, if you have to change rooms at the last minute, it's a hassle, but you still know what should happen when you get there, and you can completely give whole chunks of your presentation over to non-humans like slides and videos. Rhetors don't have to be there, and the rhetorical performance still happens. A space is still created. Let me say that again because it's an important point for my argument. Because we have collectively, in our minds, a very tightly bound object called a conference presentation, we know what kind of space that object should create. And that is ontologically networked in our heads because we have experienced conference presentations before. And that understanding allows actants to move and create geographic space of a conference presentation, even when key pieces of the rhetorical situation, like say the rhetor, aren't there. Geographical space of a conference presentation still happens. And a geographical space creates an ontological space, which in turn helps us to let geographical spaces move from place to place, and so on and so on. Objects are closely bound, almost invisible until they break networks of things. For Latour, things are associations, gatherings of people like rhetors and audiences, and non-humans like chairs and rooms and pitchers of water for the speaker and screens that are deployed in response to a matter of concern. John Law defines objects as the stabilized arrays of things in a network that generate space. Things make associations, they help us to align other things, and sometimes when those associations have a great number of actants involved, or where there's lots of activity, things become objects. And remember that the idea of a conference presentation is bound in our heads, so much so that we can move that space geographically across rooms, across hotels and cities. But a big part of why we are able to keep that object together comes from the rest of the network. So Donnie's presentation seems to be a whole, an object that contains and is a performance. But part of why that object is so successful in maintaining that black box is that there are whole other networks aligned to keep his presentation an object. We don't think about them until something rings untrue, like a slide doesn't work, and then we are reminded presentations are made up out of things. Objects that were once held together by effort begin to fall apart into things if people and non-human actors aren't paying attention, aren't engaged in activity. This is what Latour would call the thingification of an object. What he means by that is having an object turn back into all the little parts, the things that made it in the first place. John Law is interested in a discussion how some things within an object can bend, or how far they can bend before they break the object and become something new. Another way of thinking about this is at what point does an object thingify and therefore creates a different sort of space. For example, because the ontological and geographical space of the rest of the presentation is pretty stable, we can place a non-human actor in place of the rhetor and the network flexes to accommodate. Chairs, screens, people, and programs all contribute to maintaining the same work, even if the rhetor is absent. Everything keeps moving along. But what happens to a conference presentation if we remove all those other objects? Is a conference presentation so liquid that it remains the same when removed from most of its network of associations? Deprived of the geographical space? The way I will thingify Donnie's presentation by remixing it means that it will not generate the same space as it did earlier this afternoon, either ontologically or geographically. And even if I didn't do anything to it, left it up in its entirety and placed it on YouTube, it would not do the same work because the network around it, the network and space that it created, would be utterly and completely different. Presentations simply remixed, recorded, and placed online do not create the same spaces as they do offline, and therefore do not do the same rhetorical work. The recorded object does not invite, generate, or create the same topology of objects that actual real-world presentations do. At least not yet. Okay, my original question. Can a remix presentation recorded and placed online create the same rhetorical space as a live rhetorical performance? Can be answered with a definite, well, maybe. If presentations exist as objects, that is, how things come together, because they generate two kinds of spaces, ontological and geographical, we should think about, theorize, and play with the spaces created around and by objects, what some people might call infrastructure, as much as we think about, theorize, and play with the objects themselves. That is a particularly difficult task given our field's traditional focus on hermeneutic interpretation of text, but I also see trends toward scholarship with a focus on the means of rhetorical production and accounts of rhetorical practice. We can see that in our remixing and e-casting here has focused on presentations, and we have created different but similar rhetorical spaces and forums. We, as a field, have not done enough work thinking about the spaces a presentation constructs or how rhetorical performances create both ontologically networked or geographically situated spaces. If we do not consider these issues, we are just thingifying presentations. Let me remix the question I started with. Instead of can a remix presentation placed online create the same rhetorical space as a live rhetorical performance, I think we must ask ourselves how and when do we create rhetorical objects that generate similar spaces that live rhetorical performances generate? Or more succinctly, how do we do this with a broad hand gesture to the room somewhere else in an online environment? And here I will end with my broader concern. Why is this particular issue so important for underrepresented groups, people of color, and their allies? I think because these new technologies recreate new possibilities for a very old story, the second-class status of the matters of concern that we are interested in. We cannot allow virtual, digital, or remix presentations to replace or count as professional representations until we have theorized and built an infrastructure, both in theory and in non-humans, that allows remixed presentations to create the same epistemologically rich and professionalizing spaces that live performances do. Because if we just place things online and remove live performances, we will be doing nothing but leaving everyone talking, no one listening, and people quietly thingified.